activities. Some of that previously collected evidence will be considered during these hearings. Should any person have or believe they have information not brought forward, but which might be of direct significance, that person is urged to bring that information to my attention by emailing titan@titanuscg.mil. And I want to clarify that email will be monitored after this hearing session is adjourned today and is actively monitored throughout the months to continue. The NTSB has provided a representative for this hearing. Mr. Marcel Muse, seated to my far right, is the investigator in charge for the NTSB investigation. On a personal note, Mr. Muse, it's been an honor to have had the opportunity to work with you again since our time stationed together at Marine Safety Office Morgan City in the mid-90s. Sir, would you like to make a statement for the record?
Thank you, Chair, and likewise, thank you for having me. Again, I'm Marcel Muse, the NTSB's investigator in charge assigned to investigate this accident. The NTSB has joined these hearings to avoid the duplication of fact. Nonetheless, the National Transportation Safety Board will produce a probable cause and a report separate from the Coast Guard following these hearings.
Thank you, Mr. Muse. We will begin the day with testimony from Mr. Matthew McCoy, a former operations technician for OceanGate. Sir, the board's recorder, Lieutenant Steele, will now administer your oath.
Good morning. Please stand and raise your right hand. A false statement given to an agency of the United States is punishable by fine and/or imprisonment under 18 U.S.C. 1001. Knowing this, do you solemnly swear that the testimony that you are about to provide will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated.
Good morning, Mr. McCoy.
Good morning.
Thank you for making the trip today, despite the weather conditions. We appreciate it. As we start out, I'd like to start with you providing your work history and background that would be applicable to your testimony today, sir.
My work history starts out, I was an active duty member of the U.S. Coast Guard from 2002 to 2015. During that time period, I started out on the Coast Guard Cutter Spar in Kodiak, Alaska as a seaman. I attended Machinery Technician A School in 2003. I was stationed on board the Coast Guard Cutter Eagle for 3.5 years, part of the Auxiliary Division, 2004 to 2007. In 2007 to 2010, I was stationed at Coast Guard Station Kauai, where I became a boarding officer, and I served for a short time as the law enforcement petty officer for the station. And then from there, I was stationed up in Washington State at the Maritime Force Protection Unit Bangor from 2010 to 2012, where we conducted force protection security zone escorts for the submarine, the naval submarine station there. And then after that, I went to the Coast Guard Cutter Monroe in Kodiak, Alaska, and I was a member of the propulsion division from 2012 to 2015. And then at that point in time, I left active duty, and I went into the Coast Guard Reserve. From there, I moved to Oregon and worked a couple different jobs. I worked for Mutual Materials as a shift lead at their production facility while I was taking some college classes down there. Ended up taking a job and moving back to Spokane, which is where I grew up, and worked for a company called Bayfirst Solutions. I believe that they've been consolidated with another company, and did a remote contract, technical writing, developing maintenance procedure cards for the Coast Guard for the small boat product line. And then moved from there with my fiance to Kenmore, Washington, and started taking classes there at one of the local community colleges. While I was doing that, that was the beginning of 2017. Was doing that, I saw a job posting for the operations technician with OceanGate. Sounded kind of interesting, so I inquired and ended up taking the job after that spring term, or so that was in April of 2017.
Okay, and I'm going to stop you there for a second, sir. Before we get into your time at OceanGate, can you provide some more background on your Coast Guard duties, specifically in regard to the boarding officer duties you had mentioned?
Right. So I went to boarding officer school in 2009, and before that, I was a boarding team member out in Kauai. One of the things that we dealt with in Kauai specifically a lot was recreational, or I'm sorry, not recreational, but passenger vessels for hire. There's a large number of tour boats that operate on the island. So we had a lot of those vessels operating. Most of them were inspected. Sometime around 2009, 2010, the Coast Guard placed a marine inspector over on Kauai full-time. Before that, they were operating out of the Honolulu office, and he would come over and do his inspections. So he was co-located at our building there. And we were able to work with him. It was actually pretty useful having a marine inspector on site because he knew all the vessels. There's a lot of people operating outside of their the specified areas on their COIs. So he started we were being directed to actually board certified passenger vessels, which is not very common at a station level to be going out and doing enforcement actions on them. Also had the opportunity to board and terminate a couple voyages of people that were operating basically beyond a six-pack. So they were carrying more than 6 passengers for hire, and it became very clear that they were trying to specifically circumvent the rules. We had one case where a gentleman had a 100-ton license, but his vessel wasn't inspected, and what he had set up with some of the local not Airbnbs, but the condos that people would come out and rent, is that he was receiving compensation directly from the condos, and people were getting these tours as part of their rental fees. So it was included in an entire package, but he was still receiving compensation for it. I know that was passed over, I think, to the sector, and they ended up, I don't know what exactly happened. I believe administratively he ended up losing his 100-ton license out of that process. So I'd had some experience dealing with both passenger vessels as well as people trying to circumvent the rules regarding operating for hire.
Thank you, sir. And just want to know, you're speaking a little fast. I want to make sure for the record
Sorry.
that we get your transcript right.
Okay.
And also, if you need a break at any time, just let me know.
Will do.
I want to go back to your time at MST Kauai, or Station Kauai.
I was at the station, yes.
Right. And you said you met with the marine inspector from Sector Honolulu.
Yeah, so they had the sector created a billet over there, and I believe that it was established as a marine safety detachment. It was a single inspector. There was, because he just focused on doing the COIs for all of the tour boats that were operating on the island, and he got to the point where he was spending enough time on island every month that they justified it. So it was, I believe it was actually established as Marine Safety Detachment Kauai, but I would have to, I'm not sure.
Do you remember what year that was, sir?
Probably 2008.
Do you remember the name of the inspector?
Not off the top of my head.
Could it have been, for your memory, Chief Warrant Officer Dennis Schoenweather?
That does sound correct.
Just for the record, at that 2008, I was a prevention chief in Sector Honolulu,
Okay,
overseeing that unit.
okay, yeah.
Can you provide some details on the training you received regarding how to enforce passenger vessel operations?
So one of the biggest things that we looked at was that the COIs, so on the island of Kauai, there's not very many ports for these vessels to operate out of. As a station, we were limited ourselves because there's not very many places for the boats to moor up and operate out of. So basically on the south side of the island, we had Port Allen, and then on the north side of the island, they were operating out of one of the harbors up there, and then there was a couple other small boat ramps around the island. So everybody, the COIs there on the island were very restrictive. for the areas of operations that they were allowed to operate out of. So it specified what port that they were allowed to go out of, as well as the area of operations. So when you went out to the Nepali coast is the most common tour area that the vessels operated out of, because there was not good radio communications out there, and the sea state could rapidly change from side to side of the island. I think that the COIs were pretty restrictive based off of where that they were going to be operating. So they weren't allowed to, I don't think anybody had a COI to operate tours around the entirety of the island. They were be restricted to the Nepali coast, and it would say specifically that they could operate out of, say, like Port Allen. So if they were in the summertime wanted to go and operate out of, and it's slipping my mind, there was a very small boat ramp on the north side of the island, completely surrounded by a reef, had no Coast Guard markings to it whatsoever. It was used by locals. They had PVC pipe in the reef, and if you didn't know what side to go on or anything like that, it could be pretty dangerous. We never operated out of it as a station because it wasn't an officially marked entrance going in and out of there. So I don't think anybody had a COI that said that they could operate out of that, a certificate of inspection to say that they could operate out of that port. So a lot of it had to do with that, was where they were operating at, and then obviously the number of passengers that they were carrying.
And so you mentioned during your initial statement that you had left active duty in 2015 with the Coast Guard.
That's correct.
Can you explain your relationship with the Coast Guard following that date?
Yeah, so I went into the Coast Guard Reserve at that point in time, and I drilled at the base Seattle, attached to the Naval Engineering Support Unit there, which I believe has been renamed. I drilled there for 3 years, from 2015 to 2018. And then in 2018, I went back on active duty orders for about 3.5 years and worked for Coast Guard Recruiting Command. And then after that ended, I moved to, my family and I moved to North Carolina, not related to the Coast Guard, and I remain in the Coast Guard Reserve today.
Are your duties today involved with law enforcement, or is it more a different?
So I was today. So I was attached to the Coast Guard station at Elizabeth City, and then I've since recently moved to Florida for a civilian job, and I am attached. I recently became attached to Coast Guard Station Panama City, and it's just boat crew duties. I don't do any law enforcement duties there at this time.
Thank you. Now I'd like to go to your time beginning at OceanGate and your experiences there, sir.
Yes, sir. So I took the job at OceanGate in, I believe it was April of 2017 is when I began. And I initially, when I took the job and I took the interview, it was made very clear that they were working with the University of Washington, the Applied Physics Lab, and Boeing. So they had a lot of what sounded like legitimacy behind them as far as the engineering. I was made aware of the concept of creating a carbon fiber, kind of a new design, and the goal for going to the Titanic. And then I also had met during that time with David Lockridge. He had a lot of credibility behind him and his experience. I had zero experience with any sort of underwater vehicle at the time, but I was hired on mainly to help with surface support operations, small boat maintenance, things like that. So that's the main reasons why I ended up taking the job at the time. And then, I'd been given kind of I did about a trial week or so, I think, with them before I ended up accepting the job. So I was able to kind of see a lot of what initially was going on. In April of 2017, things seemed to be pretty well run in order there. I ended up, during my time there, I learned that the company had basically broken ties with the Applied Physics Lab at the University of Washington, which was concerning, and the explanation for it wasn't very clear as to why, other than that there was some disagreements. So that was my first kind of alarm bell, I think, in the back of my head. Something didn't seem right. The next one was that Boeing wasn't going to be doing the layup for the carbon fiber, that it was going to be a different company down in California. At the time, I didn't know that it was who it was. until I think we got the video, and they had hours and hours of video of this thing being laid up. And I remember looking at it, and it looked like it was just being laid up in a dirty warehouse down in California, which was also concerning. It turned out to be, I believe that was Spencer Composites. Didn't look anything like what I would have expected to see at a Boeing facility. And then the next, one of my concerns in that process was when it arrived, we had been told, and when I started, that it was going to be a 7-inch thick hole, and it showed up and it was 5 inches thick. It was just information that they weren't openly sharing with staff and employees, and so there was a lot of questions just among those of us who are not, in the engineering department as to why did the plan change and things like that, and there was no very clear answers.
And sir, I just want to clarify a few things for the record here. We are talking about at this time the first Titan hull.
Correct, yeah.
And your position was in the operations
That's
department. Who was your supervisor?
Scott Griffith.
Okay.
So I worked directly for Scott Griffith. He, at the time, in my understanding, was the director of all the service operations, but he seemed to have a level of authority over David Lockridge at the time as well.
Was David Lockridge in your chain of command?
I would say not directly.
Was there a reason that in the operations department that, as a non-engineer, you were taking an interest in the development of the submersible?
I think just in my experience as a machinery technician in the Coast Guard, as an engineer in the Coast Guard, anytime that you see anything that is out of the ordinary, you have to start asking some questions and making sure that you understand why you're doing what you're doing. I don't think that there is a qualification that I received while in the Coast Guard that didn't involve a thorough amount of knowledge and understanding of what you're dealing with. So I had the conversation with them about going through and becoming a sub-pilot at some point in time. So that was one of my concerns as well, was for the design of this overall and for its safety.
Okay, please continue.
Sure. So during my time there, and I'm not sure exactly when it dawned on me, but the business model didn't start to make sense to me. We didn't have an income stream. We didn't have the understanding of how it was. So initially they had kind of laid it out that there was this Coast Guard Foundation and that it was going to fund, through its fundraising efforts, would fund kind of a scientific mission behind OceanGate. So that was my initial understanding of how that process was going to work, is that they would be raising money and then funding various oceanographic type expeditions.
Objection, Mr. McQuaid, did you say Coast Guard Foundation? I just wanted,
The OceanGate.
OceanGate Foundation, okay.
Right. So just for the record, the Coast Guard has a foundation.
Right.
I think you may have
Did I?
said Coast Guard, but to clarify, it's the OceanGate Foundation?
Yeah, I'm sorry, the OceanGate Foundation would be funding research. The Coast Guard Foundation had nothing to do with it. I'm sorry about that. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. So that's how kind of the business model would work, and that it was going to be mainly for scientific, making the oceans more accessible to researchers and stuff that didn't have these large grants and other access to large amounts of capital to be able to lease out subs and do kind of what I think I've listened to some of the testimony. It's kind of been laid out before, the cost and expense of operating research vessels and stuff like that for oceanographic research. So at some point in time, and I don't remember what month it was, but so the company had gotten hold of a new vessel for towing. They'd bought it, I think, from the government through GSA auctions, and so it was a former Coast Guard boat, and so I had experience maintaining and operating that. So I believe it. I can't remember her last name. Renata. I believe she testified before. She had come out, and I'm not sure what the purpose of her trip was, but I ended up taking her and Joel Perry. They went scuba diving down, there's a underwater dive park, I don't remember what it's called, near Edmonds, Washington. And they had been diving down there. So during that process, I had learned of her experience with OceanGate and that she had been on the Andrea Doria dive. And that's understanding how that went and occurred, and then finding out that she had paid money to go on the dive. That was my first indicator that something wasn't correct as far as the business model. And that they were trying to circumvent things. So I initially, I think I brought this up to Scott and asked Scott Griffith, and had asked him about the business model and what the plan was for income and for money coming into the company and how things were working, and essentially trying to understand to make sure that everything was on the up and up. And I got various answers. The most common one was, well, they're mission specialists. That term was used a lot, and they're paying members of the crew. Knowing that didn't, as far as my understanding, that didn't pass muster. That isn't you can't just change the title of a person when you're receiving compensation, right? I believe that you're only allowed to receive compensation up to cover certain expenses as far as the operating expenses of the vehicle directly. I think I had dug into the regulations on that a little bit more. The CFR, it's 46 CFR. Found I believe it's the table 2 is in there, which outlined that there is no 6-pack essentially operation for a submersible. So I had taken that and I emailed that to Neil McCurdy, who was the COO, and to Scott Griffith, and I was asking about, how are we doing this with a plan to take money for going to the Titanic, and what is the operation here without having a certificate of inspection. That ended up leading to a couple conversations between myself and Scott, and ended up with Scott taking me to lunch with Stockton over at the brewery on site there in Everett. And we had lunch, and during that conversation, I brought up the concerns that I had regarding operating without a COI and not being inspected. He had a long list of issues and reasons why regarding, the complication, it was stifling the ingenuity and all these things. He tried to explain the mission specialist aspect to it. I talked about the receiving any sort of compensation aspect. He said that they were going to flag the Titan in the Bahamas and launch out of Canada so that they wouldn't fall under U.S. jurisdiction. I think I'd expressed to him that still taking U.S. passengers on there for hire at any point in time, if they touch the U.S. land, a U.S. port, that would also be of consideration. It ended, the conversation basically ended when he, after explaining that the Coast Guard had tried to, shut him down down in California, and that he wouldn't operate there anymore, but that if the Coast Guard became a problem, that he would buy himself a congressman and make it go away.
Mr. McCoy, is that a direct quote?
He said I would buy a congressman and basically the problems would go away at that point in time. And that is direct. That will stand in my mind for the rest of time. I've never had anybody say that to me directly, and I was aghast. And basically after that, I resigned from the company and I couldn't work there anymore.
I want to dig into your conversation.
Sure.
Do you remember, was anybody else there, or was this you and Mr. Rush?
Scott Griffith was there at lunch.
How did you perceive the comment that he would buy a congressman? Was it intimidating, or did you feel it was more like bluster?
I felt like that he was trying to either intimidate me or impress me. That based off of his position and standing, that he would have the influence to tout the Coast Guard rules, or he could, make any problems that might arise go away. So at that point in time, I expressed to him, I said, whatever your concerns are for him and his company, my concerns were, I said, I was still in the Coast Guard Reserve, And I was concerned that if I was to be part of anything that I felt was not correct and would be a violation of U.S. law, that would put me at jeopardy. And I felt like that I had a higher responsibility in following the law, and that I felt like that if the Coast Guard wanted to, I could be recalled and held accountable that way.
Was it your understanding that if the Titan was flagged in the Bahamas and operated out of an international port in international waters, that would be a violation of Coast Guard or U.S. law?
I wasn't sure at the time, and honestly, I still, if it never came back to the United States, then my understanding is that I don't think that would be, but I'm not sure. So, but it didn't sound like it sounded like it was more of an excuse for going forward or trying to just simply calm my fears. I didn't really believe it at that point in time.
And to clarify, did you not believe that he was going to flag the Titan in the Bahamas?
I didn't know if he was going to flag it in the Bahamas. I just didn't believe that he was never going to operate it out of the United States again. Well, I guess I hadn't operated at that point in time, but was never going to operate out of the U.S.
Was the Titan prototype or the first Titan hold being tested at that time in Puget Sound?
No, the plans, I believe, were to start testing it around February. So this was late summer. So this was September of 2017. And so I believe the plans were to start testing in Puget Sound around 2018. So they were still assembling it. So it had arrived on site. They, I believe, shortly after it arrived, then they attached the titanium ends, and then they started building out the interior of it. And that's about where it was at when I left. I know the end caps had arrived, but they had not been attached yet.
You mentioned that you resigned the following day from that, after that dinner?
Yeah, it was a lunch. I believe I gave my notice the following day.
Did you give an exit interview with anybody, sir?
I did. It was kind of an unofficial with Bonnie Carl. And she had pulled me aside as I was departing and was kind of doing, it wasn't something that I guess the company had asked for. It wasn't part of their normal policy. But as that she was overseeing the HR side, she was doing informal exit interviews with a lot of staff. She advised me that there had been a lot of turnover, so she was been digging in to try to figure out why the turnover was so high at the company.
Did you have any further discussions with your supervisor?
Just when I gave notice to Scott, that I told him that I couldn't be part of that that operation, and my concerns for the legality of how it was operating.
Did he provide any response to that, sir?
No, throughout the whole process, Scott kind of just would echo what Stockton would say. So he didn't have a lot of, he didn't really interject any of his own thoughts or opinions on that.
At the time, you would have been a reservist at base Seattle?
That's
Is that correct?
Yep.
Did you have a relationship with the sector individuals at that,
I did
at
not.
Puget Sound?
No, I did not.
I mean, by the, like marine inspectors or that department at Sector Puget Sound?
No, I did not know anybody over there at the time.
Did you make any,
I'd considered whether or not I needed to notify the Coast Guard. At the time, they hadn't dove on Titan in the U.S., so they hadn't violated anything regarding Titan. My understanding was with the Andrea Doria, that was, at my point in time, my understanding was a lot of hearsay from people, and how, I don't think anybody at the company of management had told me that, people had paid for it. I don't remember where that information came from. And that they were diving essentially but the term, dive for hire, nobody really wanted to use that. So I didn't have a lot of evidence per se that they were actively doing that. I initially kind of followed what was going on in the event that they did start diving. David Lockridge had reached out to me about his, so not too much later, I guess that was in 2018, that he had left the company and that he had filed a complaint with OSHA. And so at that point in time, I kind of assumed that it would go down that route and that OSHA, and if it passed over to the Coast Guard, would get involved. And a deeper investigation would occur. He did not ever notify me of the outcome of that. I've come to find out that he was under an NDA and more other things, so I didn't know where it went from that. And eventually I just kind of quit following the company, not thinking that they would ever actually dive Titan. So.
And so you discussed your familiarity with the certificate of inspection
Yes.
requirements. Are you familiar with oceanographic research vessel designations that are provided by the Coast Guard?
I am not. I know that they exist, but I have never dealt with them.
Understand. At this time, I'd like to go to Lieutenant Commander Emmons for any questions.
Good morning, Mr. McCoy. I just had one question. You had mentioned Mr. Lockridge in the conversation you had after he departed the company. Did you ever have any conversations with him regarding safety concerns, or did he ever have conversations with you regarding his safety concerns while you're both at the company?
Yeah, when I started at the company, there wasn't a lot of experience with anything to do with maritime operations. Pretty much when I started, it was David, and that was it. They made Scott Griffith was my boss. He came from the construction industry. It was very clear that he had no maritime experience. He had never operated on the oceans outside of some recreational stuff, and he had never worked in the marine industry. And then the other operations technician at the time was Ryan Stockfleet, and he had not come from a maritime background at all. So initially learning some of the ways that they were operating and the things that they were doing was of concern to me. And I had some concerns and regarding how we were towing the Lars operation, things like that. And then that ended up developing over time. There was a lot of safety conversations when the first Cyclops 2 or the first Titan hull arrived. That was a constant conversation amongst most everybody, almost every day.
And what were some of those conversations?
So conversation being one was the size, and then as I think it's been attested to before, the ends of it, as you looked into it, it didn't look like a very quality layup. There was a lot of conversations over how it was going to be tested, and I think that came to that it was going to be Stockton was going to take it down himself. And it was interesting. It went really quickly from, they had considered testing it out in Maryland at the ocean test facility there, but that with the cost would be too expensive, essentially, and so that Stockton would just take it down and dive it. Anytime that the idea of saying, well, why can't we just essentially put it on a cable and pull it down to the ocean floor if you want to test it on land, then that's a whole lot probably cheaper. They just wouldn't even be open to conversation about that. And so there was a lot of just concern overall. I think the engineering department didn't seem overly qualified. So that was a concern they seemed to be handling all the design, especially once I kind of found out that the University of Washington really wasn't involved anymore, and nor was Boeing. So you're looking for who is the qualified individual that's making these decisions. And it was really, the engineering staff over there was Tony Nissen, and then what I think they had one or two other full-time folks, but everybody else was basically college interns during that summer while I was there. So it was pretty concerning over the qualifications for what they were attempting to do with that submarine.
Thank you. That's all I had, Mr. Navarro.
Sir, Lieutenant Commander Whalen has a question.
Thank you, sir. Did you ever have any discussions with Mr. Rush or anybody at OceanGate regarding retired Rear Admiral Lockwood while you were there?
Yeah, so it came up at one point, I don't remember exactly when, so I learned that he was on the board, and I don't remember where I had learned that. But there was a conversation, I don't remember if it was in passing it specifically, but I think that Stockton was just trying to basically, it came up in conversation that they had been sharing information about the development and the design with the board. And I think that it was one of those conversations of trying to calm nerves and to say that, Admiral Lockwood had, they had done a brief and, he'd even commented feedback on that he was concerned over the Lars design with having those air tanks exposed and towing it in the North Atlantic. But that was about all I had for conversation regarding Admiral Lockwood. And so that was from, in conversation with Stockton. I don't remember when that was, but that was the one thing that stood out about that. I didn't know much about Admiral Lockwood.
Thank you.
So I'd like to go to the climate, work climate at OceanGate during the time you were there. Were the senior personnel open to receiving feedback? It is interesting that you had meetings with your supervisor and the CEO of the company.
Yeah, so Stockton was in and out a lot. He didn't, my interactions with him directly, he seemed he seemed to be very defensive whenever anybody asked questions that were pointed. But other than that, Neil McCurdy and Scott Griffith were both very easy to talk to. They would listen, but I feel like that there was a lot of almost mouthpiecing for Stockton and for what he was trying to accomplish. And so the one person that really took things serious was David Lockridge. And it became very apparent that he was unhappy with the interactions going on. I know that he had no faith in the engineering department there, especially Tony. And there were concerns. He started kind of filling me in, David Lockridge did, about how things went as we were talking about once the Cyclops 2 arrived, or the Titan Hull 1 arrived, and we were having these conversations over the hull, and the viewport concerns were mentioned at the time, and they were trying to, and then we also had the two contractors that worked there, Chris Imes and Tim. I can't remember Tim's last name all of a sudden, but they were both subcontractors for the company, so they would come in and out over that summer while I was there. And just talking to them, they had a lot of submersible experience. They had a lot of questions that didn't seem to be getting answered as well, regarding the design, the build, and what was occurring, and how that was proceeding forward. So, and then I had started hearing some stories about Stockton's temper. David had shared with me the story of the Andrea Doria dive and them getting stuck, and the having to get out of that situation, and Stockton's kind of his temper towards David having to take over, and that was also very concerning, that he may have not have had the temperament to be doing this kind of work.
Did anyone else ever have concerns voiced to you about Mr. Rush's temper?
Not that I can remember. I mean, the only people that were really there at the time while I was there on the operations side were Scott, Griffith, Ryan, Stockfleet, myself, David, and then I think there was an intern. She came through for a little while, Michaela. Monroe or something like that. And then there was they hired on somebody right before I left, and so, but other than that, there were very.
Was the conversation at lunch a heated discussion?
It became very tense. I felt very uncomfortable initially, just kind of laying it out, what my concerns were. I thought he'd be a little bit more receptive to it, and it was very quickly, you know, you could see the avoidance of we're not taking passengers for hire kind of thing, and then as he shifted over to well, we're going to flag it outside the U.S. It became a pretty tense conversation.
Did you clearly explain your background in the Coast Guard to Mr. Rush?
I think I had explained to him that I'd been a boarding officer in the Coast Guard, and that, you know, my understanding and experience with, you know, vessels, you know, for passengers for hire, and that, you know, I initially, when I started with the company too, I wasn't aware that submersibles didn't have a 6-passenger exemption for uninspected. So that was later. And then, excuse me, yeah, so you know, that specific information I'd found out while I was working there, but I explained it to him. He didn't seem to care.
And sir, before I go to the NTSB, we've been going for about 45 minutes. Would you like to take a break?
No, I'm okay. I'm just
Okay.
thank you.
All right, Mr. Muse?
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. McCoy. I have no questions, Mr. Chair.
Commander Willen?
Mr. McCoy, do you believe that Mr. Rush understood the regulations as they were in place at that time?
I absolutely do.
Do you know what a professional engineer is?
Yes.
And what is a professional engineer?
So a professional engineer is a person who has basically, they have to have a degree in their specialty field, and then they work in the state of Washington. I believe it's a 5-year program that they have to work under another professional engineer, and they have to meet a set of milestones, and basically at that time, then they become licensed as a professional engineer in that state that they are operating in.
And at the time that you were employed with OceanGate, was there a professional engineer that you were aware of on staff?
I don't believe so.
And in your employment now, and I believe you work for a shipbuilding company.
I do.
Do they have a safety first policy or any type of employee safety policy?
They do.
And in the policy that you work with now, if you were to bring up a safety concern, what's the process for bringing up a safety concern?
So they have a director of safety, or a safety manager at the company that oversees the entirety of the safety program. And then there's an entire safety department involved in that process. And then there's also and the safety manager answers directly to the CEO of the company. So there's not any of the other directors or vice presidents are in that chain. And then any complaints that are brought up or concerns are basically are brought up and forwarded to that department and then investigated by that department, who acts independently from the rest of the shipyard.
And was that similar to the same process as when you were with OceanGate?
No, it was, there was no formal kind of an outside of your normal chain safety process. It was basically you would bring up your concerns directly to your supervisor, and they would work their way up, and they were always adjudicated somewhere up between whoever your director was and Stockton.
Was there a safety officer at OceanGate that you were aware of?
No.
Thank you.
Mr. Fawcett?
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Did you retain copies of any emails between yourself and OceanGate related to your safety concerns?
I do not have any emails retained from 2017, no.
And then, did you hear or see any communication regarding documenting or state registering the Titan?
No, I think I had asked about that because they did have Washington numbers on for the Antipodes and for Cyclops 1, so they had WN numbers for those two, so those were clearly U.S. flagged vessels. I believe I asked if that was the plan, and I think that the answer was just no. And then it wasn't until lunch that they talked about with Stockton, where he talked about flagging it in the Bahamas. That was the first time I'd heard that.
So as a Coast Guard boarding officer, if you saw a vessel that didn't have registration numbers in navigable waters of the United States, what action would you take?
Well, so they would not be allowed to operate. There would definitely be, at a minimum, it's going to be a citation written. You're going to, being that they're not allowed to operate in U.S. waters, you're not going to allow them to continue their trip, so they're going to have to head home and be terminated, and it would most likely be a citation, and then it would be entered into missile and tracked from there if they attempted to, I guess, try to operate further.
And that's the Coast Guard's database we've talked about here at great length.
Correct, yes, the marine information for safety and law enforcement, I believe.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Mr. McCoy, during your entire time in the Coast Guard, have you ever encountered a vessel that did not have either a U.S. document, U.S. flag, or a state registration underway?
I had I did a boarding on a vessel. It was a sailboat that had, it had conflicting information regarding, so it had been U.S. documented, but the documentation had never been apparently transferred over to the new owner. So the bill of sale and all the information that said who the ownership was. So essentially at that point in time, I believe it was considered to be, we considered it to be an undocumented vessel, being that it had not been transferred over, and he was cited for that.
And just to clarify, that would be an expired registration or documentation?
Correct, yes, yeah. So it was a previously documented vessel at that point in time. The certificate of, sorry, the certificate of documentation was no longer valid.
Are you aware of how the Coast Guard tracks recreational and commercial vessels in the missile database?
Yes, in the terms, if you're referring to, so by vessel name, you can search by VIN number, and you could also search it by their state or their documentation number.
And by VIN, you mean vessel identification number?
Correct, yes.
And that would be the Coast Guard documentation number if federally documented?
Correct, yes.
From your experience, would it be hard to track a vessel in our database that was not registered or documented?
It would. It would probably need you would probably need some amplifying information in there. I would assume if it's going to be flagged in any country or any state, I believe it's common though that they would have to have affixed a VIN number to it or a vessel identification number to it. So if otherwise it would just be, if there's no VIN number, then that I would assume as a boarding officer that it's not flagged or documented.
During your time at OceanGate, the approximately 6 months, are you aware of any operations that OceanGate conducted with the Antipodes or the Cyclops?
During my time there, it was all just test dives, so testing equipment and doing some training dives. So with Antipodes, we towed it out a few times just out there in Everett Harbor, or it was just testing at the dock. The biggest thing for Antipodes at that point in time was that they were just making sure that they were keeping it up to date, and because it had an ABS class, I think that they did an ABS inspection on it that summer, so that was part of the reason why Tim had come up, because Tim and Chris Imes they helped a lot with the maintenance of Antipodes and Cyclops. And then Cyclops was just training and testing of various equipment. So, and that was all done there out in the harbor, just outside of, in Possession Sound, just outside of Everett. And that was that was when they actually installed the modem. So they were doing all like the text information Prior to that, it was all voice communications through the basically the underwater phone that was used.
Which submersible was that, sir?
That was on Cyclops 1.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to go to OceanGate for any questions.
Sure, thank you. Mr. McCoy, you mentioned that you started at OceanGate in April 2017. When did you leave?
September of 2017.
Thank you. And Commander Whalen asked you about Admiral Lockwood. Did you have any conversations with Admiral Lockwood directly?
No, I never met him.
In response to Mr. Neubauer's question, you mentioned the dive operations with Antipodes and Cyclops just now. Did those involve anyone, to your knowledge, who paid to go on those dive operations?
No, I believe everybody that was on the submersibles was all OceanGate staff.
Thank you.
Mr. McCoy, before we conclude with your testimony, I'd like to call a short recess to make sure we don't have any final questions for you, sir.
Sure.
The hearing will now recess and reconvene at 10 a.m. The hearing is now back in session. At this time, does the board or OceanGate have any final questions for Mr. McCoy? Mr. McCoy, is there anything that I haven't asked or the board hasn't asked that would be of value to this investigation that you have?
I think we've covered most of my experience with OceanGate.
Thank you again, sir, for reaching out to the board during this proceeding. We appreciate you changing your schedule to be here today. You are now released as a witness at this formal hearing. If I later determine this board needs additional information from you, including any emails that you may have, if you can check the archive again, I would appreciate that. We will contact you through directly. And if you have any questions about this investigation, you may contact the investigations recorder, Lieutenant Kelly Steele. Thank you again, sir.
Thank you.
We will now take a recess. Our next witness, Captain Jamie Frederick, is scheduled to be at 10:45. If we can contact the witness, if he's here, we are going to try to start at 10:30. The hearing is now This hearing is now back in session. We will now hear testimony from Captain Jamie Frederick, the Sector Commander of Coast Guard Sector Boston. Captain Frederick, it's good to see you again, and I appreciate you making the trip down from your command duties in Boston. At this time, our recorder, Lieutenant Steele, will administer your oath, sir.
Good morning, Captain. Could you raise your right hand? A false statement given to an agency of the United States is punishable by fine and/or imprisonment under 18 U.S.C. 1001, and may also be subject to discipline under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Knowing this, do you solemnly swear that the testimony that you're about to provide will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. You may be seated.
Captain, before we begin, just want to clarify, we try to minimize the use of acronyms, so if you can define those as if they're used. And if you ever need a break, just let me know and we'll take a recess. I see that you have counsel with you today. Counselor, can you identify yourself for the record, please?
Lieutenant Commander Jesse Brenton, 1st Coast Guard District.
Thank you. Captain Frederick, I'd like to start by going over your education and work experience background that would be relevant to your testimony today, sir.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. First, I'd like to, on behalf of the entire Unified Command, offer our deepest condolences to the family and friends of the 5 people that were lost aboard Titan. I've been in the Coast Guard for 30 years. I've had a variety of both operational and staff assignments. I think for the purposes of the hearing, I'll just focus on the operational assignments that have given me my search and rescue experience. So I enlisted in the Coast Guard in 1994, and I served at 2 units as an enlisted member on an operational multi-mission cutter, and then at a small boat station where I was a boat coxswain. So basically I drove a small boat and conducted search and rescue operations at the very tactical level. After officer candidate school, I served at Coast Guard Group Key West, where I worked in the command center, and we ran the operations in the Florida Keys. While the SAR system has changed a little bit, for all intents and purposes, I was a search and rescue mission coordinator there and ran search and rescue and law enforcement operations. My next operational assignment, I was the commanding officer of Coast Guard Motor Lifeboat Station, Cape Disappointment, Washington. That's at the mouth of the Columbia River. It's known for the lifeboat school is also there, a center of excellence for heavy weather boat operations, and my unit was in charge of conducting search and rescue on the Columbia River Bar, the offshore environment there, and the Columbia River. Next, I was the chief of law enforcement at Sector Northern New England, where I oversaw law enforcement operations in Maine, New Hampshire, and then on Lake Champlain in Vermont and New York. Fleeted up to be the chief of response there, where I was then in charge of all of the operations. Essentially, it's like being an operations officer under the sector commander in that same area. I then went to work at the Coast Guard 1st District, where I was the chief of law enforcement for basically just a broader area. The 1st District encompasses from basically Sandy Hook, New Jersey to the northern border. And I ran or oversaw the policy and operations for law enforcement, but I also was a search and rescue mission coordinator, and I held active search suspension authority at D1. And that is the position I was in last June when the Titan case took place. In July of this year, I assumed responsibilities as the sector commander and captain of the port in Boston, Massachusetts.
Sir,
Yes.
just to clarify, can you define what D1 is and what that means from a Coast Guard standpoint?
Sure. So the Coast Guard is broken into districts. So on the East Coast, there are several districts up and down the East Coast. There's 5 in total. The 1st Coast Guard District is basically the Northeast. So from Sandy Hook, New Jersey to the Canadian border. And as part of that responsibility, the 1st Coast Guard District, the command center there is also Rescue and Coordination Center Boston, and those responsibilities go to 1,300 nautical miles offshore.
Thank you, sir. Any other background before
Well,
we?
you'd asked about education, so I've been to various schools in the Coast Guard for search and rescue planning and oversight. I hold a bachelor's degree from Troy University and a master's degree from Johns Hopkins.
Thank you, sir. I'd now like to, for you to describe the area of responsibility and how the Coast Guard prepares for search and rescue offshore from the first district.
Sure. So I think maybe I want to take it to kind of an elementary level to start, and because when we talk about the timeline, I'll talk about receiving the call. So I want to explain what that means. All over the Coast Guard, we have sectors, which are work under the districts. And I don't want to make this confusing, but and then we have districts, and the district has a command center where the sectors within that district report to. So in this case, it was the 1st Coast Guard District, which I said also encompasses Rescue Coordination Center, Boston. In those command centers, we have 24/7, 365 days a year watchstanders who are professional search planners, mission coordinators, and they stand those watches. And so if I refer to a command center, in this case, the 1st District, that would be the 24/7 watchstanders that are there. Now, outside of the command center, there's a very deliberate chain of command in the search and rescue chain of command, and it consists of a search and rescue mission coordinator, which is deliberately outside of the command center to provide oversight and search planning. And then active search suspension authority, that's the role that I was serving in during the Titan case. That's an additional layer of oversight. There's 2 additional responsibilities that generally come with that position. One is you're generally the person that communicates with the next of kin and families during the case. And you are also the person, if and when a case gets to a point where you suspend the search, that would make that decision. In that role, you work directly for the SAR coordinator. In this case, the SAR coordinator was the 1st District commander, and that was Rear Admiral John Mauger.
Thank you, Captain. Now can you go back to the events of how you were notified of the Titan initially back on June 2023?
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. And before you do that, sir, can you define AOR?
Yeah,
For the,
sorry, it's an area of responsibility.
and for the rest of your testimony, we've defined search and rescue as SAR, so you can just
Thank
use
you.
SAR.
Thank you. Okay, so sure, I'm happy to talk about the timeline in general terms, and we can drill down if anywhere that you want to. So on Sunday, and I'll use so for the time, I'll just use local time in Boston, Massachusetts, so Eastern Standard Time. We received a call into the 1st District Command Center at 5:40, so 17:40, 5:40 p.m. We received a call, and it was a report of an overdue submersible at the site of the Titanic. So in simplest terms, when that call came into the command center, it was an overdue. And we consider an overdue vessel. There's different ways that you classify search and rescue cases and different scenarios that get you into different phases. In this case, we were in the distress phase. And an overdue vessel, in the simplest terms, means that you have confirmed departure from a location and confirmed non-departure. And that would put you in the distress phase. Now, in each of our command centers around the country, these professional watchstanders have checklists that they go through. They're often referred to as a QRC, which is a quick response card. And there are quick response cards for all sorts of scenarios, from the most basic to the most complex. And in this case, we were really working off 2. There's one that exists for subsurface search and rescue, and then, of course, the overdue case that I spoke of. So our watchstanders were working through those. Of course, the call was anomalous, and it was, I talked about it being simple in the terms of an overdue, but it was complex for many, many reasons. One, you're talking about a multi-dimensional search, subsurface and surface. because at the time we were working under the understanding that the emergency procedures for Titan was that the vessel would surface, and the distance offshore, the fact that there were no readily accessible response resources on the surface. But what I would say is our watchstanders are incredible professionals, and the first thing that they did is to look for air assets. And we happen to have a Coast Guard, United States Coast Guard C-130 on deck in St. John's. And ironically, that aircraft was on deck in St. John's because they were conducting an international ice patrol mission, which is something the Coast Guard does as a result of the sinking of the Titanic. We were able to speak to them, and the crew had the capacity to fly, so we immediately launched them to conduct a surface search. And then we started working through those checklists, and over the course of going into Sunday evening, there were a lot of things that were happening. We reached out to our higher headquarters at Coast Guard Atlantic area, and they were the main conduit to the United States Navy at Fleet Forces Command, their Battle Watch. We were talking to them. We were querying the Navy if they had any available resources. Unfortunately, they did not have any available resources that could respond in a timely manner to the area. We were obviously talking to the Canadians, who were incredible throughout this entire search. And one of the things that we found on the checklist for submersible search and rescue, and I'll tell you, in my 30 years, I've worked thousands of search and rescue cases, this was the first time I'd ever worked a subsurface search. There's an organization under NATO called ISMERLO. You're going to get me on the acronym here. I think it's the International Submarine Escape and Rescue Liaison Office. I think those are all the words. I may have gotten them out of order. And we reached out to them, and they have a 24/7 phone number you can call, and they start going through their procedures. And as part of their procedures, they put out a broadcast, basically a global broadcast to vessels at sea that have subsurface capability. So really what we were looking for at that time is ROV capability. And the vessel, Deep Energy, responded. They were a deep sea pipe laying vessel, and they agreed to start heading to that location with their ROVs. Now, they had 3,000 meter ROVs on board. From the time of initial notification, I believe that Deep Energy was on scene within 34 hours. By Monday morning, we were flying Canadian aircraft, both for the surface search, and at that point, we were flying P-3 aircraft with the capability to listen with sonar capability. And really, I guess an important point I want to make is from the initial call, from the time that we launched that Coast Guard C-130 out of St. John's, we flew nose to tail. So that really means when an aircraft was landing, another one was basically taking off all the way up until Thursday. We were also working with the Canadian Coast Guard to get Canadian Coast Guard cutters on scene because they were the closest. We knew that we had a Coast Guard cutter that was working off, a United States Coast Guard cutter that was working off of Greenland, but they were, the initial reports were they were 4 to 5 days away. And we were reaching out to as many partners as we could, including the New York Air National Guard, who flew several sorties for us as well. Over the course of Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we continued those air searches. Deep Energy arrived on scene on Tuesday morning, and they immediately commenced ROV operations. And again, they were limited at 3,000 meter ROVs. A point I want to make there, so one of the most basic principles in search and rescue is that you go to the last known position. And that's something that, of course, we were efforting, but we were limited in our capability. And When Deep Energy arrived on scene, they pushed one of their 3,000-meter ROVs beyond its operating capability in an effort to get to the last known position, and it failed. And they brought it back to the surface, and from that point forward, we did not push beyond the operating capability. And I think I'll get back to, we can talk about the ROV planning outside of that. It's kind of a separate string of effort. At the same time, we were working vigorously to put together a team of experts. And those team of experts ultimately formed the unified command. And I strongly believe that we brought in the world's best experts. We had, and I'll probably miss some groups, but we were obviously working with the U.S. Navy through Fleet Forces Command. We had ComSub, PAC and LANT, NAVC, Naval Sea Services Command, and then we also were working with Navy, so SUPSALV, which is Supervisor of Dive and Salve Operations, the United States Navy.
And Captain, I think you said ComSub?
Yeah, so Commander of Submarine Forces, both Pacific and Atlantic. We also had subject matter experts on board, so submariners from the Royal Navy. We reached out to, we're lucky to be located in Boston, Massachusetts, where we have a lot of resources. We reached out to Woods Hole, to the Oceanographic, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and they sent us subject matter experts, particularly one subject matter expert who was a retired Navy captain, sub-commodore. He was in the Unified Command. And we brought this team together, frankly, because OceanGate was operating without a plan. And we brought a team together to come up with a plan to effect a search.
Captain, I just want to clarify a point on that. When you say they were operating without a plan, do you mean a backup emergency rescue plan?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And, you know, if you look at it, so essentially on Sunday afternoon from a standing start, we were handed, I think what many would think is, before this, almost an impossible task. And from 5:40 Eastern Standard Time on Sunday to 9 o'clock in the morning on Thursday, we had a 6,000-meter ROV on the ocean floor at the site of the Titanic. And I've talked quite a bit with some of the experts from SUPSALV, and they will say that they consider that as unprecedented, and can talk about some of the logistics it took to move those ROVs.
And Captain, just for the record, I want to clarify some of the dates. When you say Sunday, that would be June 18th, 2023.
Correct.
Tuesday, June 20th, 2023.
Yes.
And then that Thursday, approximately 4 days later, June 22nd, 2023.
Correct.
Okay. Captain, can you clarify why the U.S. Coast Guard has responsibility for international waters over the Titanic for search and rescue?
Absolutely. So that's a question we've received quite a bit, I think. And what I would say is, it was never a question within the community of experts that understand offshore search and rescue. The world maritime is divided into regions with responsibility clearly defined in international law. And the area that the Titanic rests is clearly within RCC Boston, so Rescue and Coordination Center Boston's area of responsibility. So I think an important point is those predetermined search and rescue agreements are critical. And what that means is there was never a delay within the community of professional responders. When the Canadians in Halifax received the call, they knew immediately it was within Boston's responsibility, and they reached out to us. And the other thing I would say is, we work so closely with the Canadians on a day-to-day basis. We exercise plans. while we never exercised a plan for a submersible rescue, we certainly exercised them for search and rescue, for oil spill response, and we have close working relationships, and those paid dividends during this case.
Captain, when you talk about unified command, the concept, can you give a little background on that? And was it a physical location or virtual for the unified command?
So it was both. So under the Integrated Command System, ICS, ICS exists for large scale or even moderate scale responses, and what it gives you an opportunity to come together and use a common terminology. It sets up a battle rhythm for meetings, a battle rhythm for making decisions. In this case, we knew clearly that we didn't have all the subject matter expertise, and we needed to bring as much of that to the table as we could as quickly as possible. And we had a large number, we had more people in person than virtually. However, we leveraged technology to the full extent, from Microsoft Teams holding meetings to talking to the cutters on scene, the Canadian Coast Guard cutters, and the Polar Prince via satellite comms.
And earlier, you mentioned, I believe you said you flew Canadian air assets. And I just want to make sure, for the record, that you were directing our Canadian air assets to fly. It wasn't a Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard flight, correct?
Well, we had both, right? So there were multiple sorties throughout the course of the search. United States Coast Guard C-130s flew, along with the New York Air National Guard and then the Canadian Air Force.
Thank you. And as the SAR coordinator, you were able to direct Canadian assets?
Absolutely.
Captain, can you talk about some of the information and challenges that you had up until the point where you were able to get a visual on the wreckage itself?
Well, I mean, the case was challenging for many reasons. The distance offshore, the fact that we didn't have Canadian or Coast Guard surface assets there for a few days. The fact that we were limited initially to 3,000 meter ROVs. We were working vigorously to bring in additional capability. I mean, that's obvious, right? Because we got to the point of having a 6,000 meter ROV on scene on Thursday. I'm happy to talk to some of how that was planned.
Before we go to that, sir, I'm curious if you had communications with OceanGate or the crew of the Polar Prince that were on scene at the site.
We did. We had been talking to OceanGate and the Polar Prince throughout the entire search. In fact, in the early days of the search, the Polar Prince actually served as the on-scene commander because we were limited and that was the only option.
And it is standard practice in the Coast Guard to use a commercial asset if necessary to be the initial on-scene commander?
It is. I mean, it's not ideal, but in this case, again, it was the only option. And so to have an on-scene presence, that you have eyes on scene with communication capability. Again, they had satellite comms, so we were talking to them on a routine basis. And, ideally, we would have liked to have transferred on-scene commander to a United States Coast Guard cutter or a Canadian Coast Guard cutter, which ultimately we did, but that took some time.
Do you remember when that transfer occurred, sir?
I believe it happened on Wednesday. And that's not to say, so I believe that John Cabot may have arrived some hours before that, maybe even into Tuesday, but you have to understand that transfer takes time. Whoever is serving as on-scene commander has lines of communication established, and there are plans in place, and you want to make sure the transfer is smooth and you don't lose any of the progress that you've made. So it's a deliberate process. It takes some time, and we did it as quickly as possible.
And Captain, was it the understanding of the Unified Command that the Titan had survival systems on board that would allow the crew to remain alive, submerged for a period of time?
Yes, it was. We understood that that was possible. There was also From the polar prints, OceanGate was also presenting us a scenario where the Titan could have been somewhere in the water column. So we focused our subsurface efforts with the 3,000-meter ROVs to search the water column. We were working with subsurface experts within the Unified Command who were gathering undersea currents and data that gave us additional information to focus those searches. At the same time, as early as Monday, when the P3s were flying, we were receiving information from the aircraft that they were detecting underwater noises via sonar. And we were exploring all of those pieces of data as well.
Sir, in your experience, can you explain the Coast Guard's duties and approach about possibility of survival and how you weighed that to potential suspension of the case?
Well, I would say in this case, we really never even got to the point to have the discussion of suspension. And I wouldn't even want to speculate on when that would happen, but I will talk about the amount of due diligence that we put into every single search and rescue case. Every day around this country, the United States Coast Guard oversees search and rescue. And I think maybe for the purposes of this hearing, I will present an example of a very simple overdue case. So if you were departing on a sailboat from Charleston to, say, Key West, and you filed a float plan and you told your family or a friend that you were going to leave on a certain day and arrive on a certain day, and you gave additional details to that, and then you didn't arrive when you're supposed to, and you have no, and so let's say the family or friend who's in contact with you now has no contact. So now you have lost comms, you have confirmed departure and confirmed non-arrival. So that's exactly where we were on Sunday the 18th with Titan. But now let's take it again to the more simple case of a sailboat. We would go into a distress phase in a case like that, and we would search. And I can't tell you, it would depend on a case by case, but it may be a track line search where an aircraft would fly the route. It could be, there could be many different options based on the information, the weather, and a lot of different things. But the point is, we would have assets up looking. We would also be doing investigative work, calling different marinas or places where they possibly could have gone to, and we would run every lead to ground. Now, I'll present another scenario, another piece to that scenario. If we received a report in that case with the sailboat from Charleston to Key West that someone saw a vessel that fit that description, it was a credible source, it looked very much like it, and it pulled into Isle Morada. We would run that lead to ground. We would send either a Coast Guard unit or local law enforcement to that marina, and we would investigate. And we would not stop search efforts until we got to a point where there's no longer a reasonable expectation of survival, or we found what we were looking for. So I bring that up in context of reports of sounds and other things that were happening, and the fact that we continued to search. Well, that's what we do in every search and rescue case.
Are you aware of other Coast Guard search and rescue cases that expanded beyond several days to weeks or that period of time?
Yeah, absolutely. And every case is different. If you're searching for a person in the water who is reported maybe fell off a sailboat and is in a life jacket and you're in the North Atlantic, well, obviously that period of search may be shorter because of water temperature. It's much different if you're searching for a person in the water maybe wearing a life jacket in the Caribbean. And in this case, we had a lot of different information coming in, and with it, we were within 96 hours in this entire case.
And Captain, I believe you testified that over your 30-year career, you had not been involved in a subsurface search and rescue case. Is that
Yes,
correct?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
Are you aware of any other Coast Guard subsurface searches in recent history or even the last 30 years?
No, I'm not personally aware of any.
Are you aware of the last subsurface search that the Coast Guard conducted?
I am not.
So is it fair to say that was the first time you'd ever used the subsurface QRC for
It certainly is for me. I would point out one thing though. It's not uncommon for the Coast Guard to oversee operations where maybe we don't have all the subject matter expertise. I don't want to go too far, but I would say, look no further to an oil spill where we bring in subject matter experts into a unified command. It may be a science support coordinator who helps us figure out booming strategies and the recovery of oil. It's not even the first time the Coast Guard has overseen underwater operations. I think you could look to the Deepwater Horizon event, where we certainly didn't have subject matter expertise to run ROV operations in thousands of feet of water to cap a oil head, an oil well. But we brought those subject matter experts into the unified command, and under our oversight and leadership, we conducted the operation. And I think that's an important point because that's what the United States Coast Guard brought to this case. We brought a bias for action. We brought leadership, and we brought experience in bringing different agencies together in a response operation. And the Coast Guard has a unique competency, I believe, and ability to bring those partners together, both private and public, and in this case, international, which we certainly needed.
In your opinion, is that the power of the Incident Command System, ICS, to bring expertise needed into an incident?
It is, and it provides a mechanism to do that. In a search and rescue case, it may not always be the absolute perfect fit, but in this case, it gave us the avenue and the structure to bring those experts in to get the mission accomplished.
Captain, I'd like to now discuss some of the ROV choices and availabilities to the Unified Command during the incident. We've heard previous testimony that the Coast Guard did not utilize available ROVs for the search and rescue effort, and I'd like to hear if you can clarify that point, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So a couple things. I think I'd first like to frame kind of my response in saying that there's limited resources worldwide, right? What we're looking for obviously is a 6,000 meter ROV. So those resources are limited, and then they need to be available, and they need to be available quickly. And in any response, you may not always get the perfect resource to the scene, but you want to get the best resource there as quickly as possible. And I think it's important to understand a few things with respect to the ROV planning in this case. So the first point is that OceanGate reached out to Pelagic on Sunday, the 18th. And I believe, I don't know the exact timeline, but it was somewhere right around the time that we received initial notification. So OceanGate had already reached out to Pelagic in conjunction with notifying the Coast Guard. Now, what I would tell you, Pelagic at that point started making preparations, getting their team together. They had their ROV that ultimately made it to the scene, the 6,000 meter Odysseus ROV, was a flyaway kit, meaning it was packaged and ready to go, but not, it's my understanding, and I'm not an expert, but my understanding is there was some workup time and some preparations that still needed to be made. And normally, all of this would take weeks, if not longer. So Pelagic started making those arrangements. Now, what Pelagic didn't have, they had the flyaway kit, they had the 6,000 meter ROV, they had the expertise, and they knew they could get there, but they didn't have the ability to move all that equipment. And what we offered from the Unified Command is the ability to talk to United States Transportation Command and move that heavy equipment. So, and I think I heard an earlier witness say that we didn't use an ROV from New York. So the Pelagic ROV did come from Western New York, and we flew that ROV with the help of U.S. Transcom, so Transportation Command, and it took 3 C-17 heavy lift aircraft, and I think it was in the neighborhood of, in total, 70,000 pounds of equipment. That's an immense amount of equipment to move. Now, to just talk about those logistical challenges, That equipment had to be moved to St. John's, and then it had to be trucked from the airport to the seaport, and then it had to be loaded onto a vessel of opportunity, which was the Horizon Arctic. Now, again, normally would take weeks to do this, and I think there's an important point to be made here as well. It's not as simple as when that equipment shows up at the seaport, you don't just pick it up and put it on the vessel of opportunity, but it has to be welds. There has to be brackets that are fabricated, and it has to be welded to the deck. And it was an incredible team effort with the team from Pelagic and all the folks on the ground that went through that, and they were able to load all that equipment on board and get the Horizon Arctic underway. I believe on early in the morning on Tuesday. Is that correct? What is the timeline? No, it was Wednesday. So Wednesday the 21st at I think 5:30. So 5:30 in the morning, local time in St. John's. They were underway. And of course, they were on scene by Thursday, and they arrived in the early hours, and by 9 o'clock local, they were on the ocean floor, and we had discovered the debris field. While all of this is going on, we were working with the subsurface team of experts in the Unified Command, and they were the folks from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, who have done extensive mapping of the ocean floor of the site of Titanic. They were providing the team information on where they believed the Titan would be, and their information was accurate. When we were able to get the 6,000 meter ROV on scene, they quickly found the debris field. An additional thing I wanted to bring up on the ROV. So on top of, in addition to working to get the Pelagic team out there, we're talking about that level of heavy lift. I mean, that's an immense amount of effort to get that equipment on scene. At the same time, we had a backup plan. And the backup plan was there was a French vessel with a 6,000 meter ROV, and they were en route. What they didn't have was their ROV, the team of operators. And we were working behind the scenes as quickly as we could to get that team of French operators there, and that was a pretty immense effort in itself. And the Canadians were incredible in that effort. The French team flew into St. John's. They were escorted by RCMP, a police escort to the port. They loaded onto a Canadian Coast Guard cutter, and they were headed out to scene. And they arrived on scene on Thursday, but of course by that time, the Odysseus was already in the water.
Captain, I think you mentioned it earlier, but were there any communications issues between the Canadian Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard, or any other like military type, not military assets, but government assets?
No, not beyond the normal, maybe normal challenges you would, in any response. Communications can be a challenge, but I would say nothing that impacted our ability to get the mission done. In fact, I would actually argue the opposite, that the communication between the U.S. Navy and the United States Coast Guard was incredible. Our Coast Guard Atlantic Area Command, Atlantic Area Commander at the time, Vice Admiral Lunday, was having communications directly with the Navy, and we were receiving all of the assets that we needed.
During your time in the 1st District, did you ever have any exercises or search and rescue exercises with the Canadians prior to this event, sir?
We do. We exercise with the Canadians on an annual basis.
Did that always occur every year?
It does. Whether it be a tabletop exercise where you're just exercising the plans and the lines of communication, or exercises where you're actually putting assets out on the water.
During the response to the Titan, were there any weather factors that influenced the search?
There were several days where the ceiling was low. I think the aircraft were limited to there were 500 feet, 500-foot ceiling at certain points. I mean, in general terms, the search conditions were good. That's relative, right? You're 1,000 miles off the coast of, or 900 miles from Cape Cod, 400 miles south of St. John's. It gets rough, but we weren't hampered severely by weather.
Thank you, Captain. At this time, I'd like to pass the questioning to Lieutenant Commander Emmons.
Good afternoon, Captain Frederick. Can you explain who's in charge of search and rescue operations for the Coast Guard in the distress phase?
Well, I mean, the SAR coordinator is always ultimately in charge, but the search and rescue mission coordinator is the one who is overseeing the operations.
In general, you had mentioned your search and rescue training, but can you kind of describe the training that command center staffs receive to execute search missions?
Sure, there are formalized schools at our training center in Yorktown. There's also on-the-job training. There's extensive qualifications and tasks that you have to do, and it takes, ultimately to be a search and rescue mission coordinator, it takes years.
And is underwater search and rescue taught in SAR school?
No, I don't think there's any detailed level of course material there. Now, understand this is these events don't happen with a high level of frequency. So again, though, you can apply the basic principles of search and rescue really to any response, and that's what we did in this case.
Was there any impact to Titan search operations due to personnel shortages, or either on ashore or the ships or aircrafts that would normally have been utilized for the search mission?
No, not to our resources. What I would say, though, is that anytime you deal with a response of this nature, a large-scale response, your local resources are, you're overwhelmed in the beginning. But what you do, and what we did, is you bring additional resources in, and we did that. We brought in the Coast Guard incident management team, some additional public affairs support, and we started to build a team of support around the existing command structure. And another thing that we did is we separated the Titan search from the watch floor, so from normal First District operations, because as this is going on, there are operations that are going on all over the Northeast, so the First District's the Northeast, on any given day. I mean, look at a day, just yesterday, we had search and rescue cases going on in the Northeast. We had our sector in New York was overseeing maritime security operations for the United Nations General Assembly. I mean, these things are going on a daily basis, and when you have a large-scale event, you need to separate that and keep everyday operations going on.
Was all the equipment that would be used in the search and rescue operations in a full state of readiness, such as computer systems, software, radio, communications, vessel assets?
Yes.
What are the Coast Guard procedures, what Coast Guard procedures will cover the planning and execution of subsea search and rescue operations?
Well, like I said, there's a checklist for that you go through, and in many respects, the initial actions are the same, right? We talked about, we put assets on scene because, again, we had to operate under the assumption that there's a possibility that the Titan was on the surface. So that planning, we're calculating the set and the drift through computer models that we have, and coming up with search patterns to continue to search the surface. At the same time, we were conducting subsurface searches with really being driven by the data that we were receiving from the experts in the Unified Command.
How do those QRC code, the quick response cards, how are they developed?
So they are living documents, I think is probably the most important piece of that, right? We, as technology changes, as the environment changes, those are updated. There's always, so they exist, but there's always an opportunity to change those, and so they're developed under they're developed using our experience and expertise, but again, they continue to grow and develop as things change.
And yeah, I know you kind of went into this a little bit, but at the time of the incident, did the Coast Guard maintain a list of resources that might be contacted to assist in underwater search activities, or did that come from the company who maintains like a list of available resources?
Well, we didn't have a list of necessarily available ROV resources, but what we did have is, I mean, the one of the first places we reached out to was to the United States Navy, and then we started to work from there.
You had mentioned that OceanGate didn't have a rescue plan. Can you kind of go into that? How did you know they didn't have a plan?
Well, if they did, it was never presented to us in the Unified Command.
When did you become aware of reports of noises being detected on sonar buoys in the vicinity of the search location? Can you kind of expand on the details of if you received reports of noises?
Sure. Really, as soon as the P3 started flying, so Monday the 19th, and we immediately were, so a couple things we did there. We were investigating the noises, both with the polar prints and their sonar capability, obviously with additional P3 flights, and then we were gathering all of that data over the course of really the next 24 hours or so, and we packaged that data and we gave it to the United States Navy, and they analyzed it. And I believe by, I don't know, I can't remember the exact date, either Tuesday, the 20th, or Wednesday, we received a definitive answer from the United States Navy that, two pieces of information that they told us. One was that the sounds were not coming in regular intervals, as was being reported. There was a lot of reports of 30-minute intervals. The Navy looked at that data and said that that wasn't the case, and two, they were 100% certain that it was not human in nature or knocking on a hull of a vessel. And as soon as we received that information, I personally shared that with the family before we released it in the media, with the families, I'm sorry.
How did receiving that report affect your search and rescue decisions?
Well, it's one piece of data, right? There were about 1,000 pieces of data coming into us. We were also very, very close to having the 6,000-meter ROVs on scene at that point, and we knew exactly what we needed to do, and that was to get the pelagic ROV on scene early Thursday morning and get to the last known position. So we continued to work as vigorously as we could to reach that goal.
Were you ever told by crew members or employees of OceanGate on board the Polar Prince that they felt or heard something around the time they lost communications with the Titan?
No, that was never passed to the Unified Command.
Did you only direct the surface search and rescue assets, or did you also direct the underwater search and rescue assets, such as the ROVs?
The Unified Command was directing both. We were providing that information to the on-scene assets on where to focus those underwater searches. Again, being limited at the 3,000 meter, we were doing everything we could, working with the Polar Prince and OceanGate under that theory that there was a possibility that they could be somewhere in the water column, which, as you can imagine, that's an incredibly difficult search area.
And you kind of mentioned it, you start with the last known position. Is that kind of what you did to direct those with the decisions you made with the Unified Command to put the ROV down there? You just kind of started with the last position? Do you just kind of send it straight down, search patterns? How does that work?
Well, yes. However, we were working with the team really from Woods Hole and the other subsurface experts to take in some additional data, and they gave us a location which was accurate.
When exactly did the Unified Command stand up, and who made the decision to stand up the Unified Command?
Yeah, so Rear Admiral Mauger, the SAR coordinator, made that decision, and it was on Monday the 19th.
And you had talked a lot about subject matter experts in the Unified Command. Who else was part of the Unified Command?
I think I gave a full list there. I mean, we, from the United States Navy to the Canadian Air Force, the Canadian Coast Guard, the team from Woods Hole. I'm happy to provide a detailed list to the board. I think I named just about everybody that was, but I'm happy to provide that for the record.
Was OceanGate part of the Unified Command?
They were. I mean, the Polar Prince, I think, yes, OceanGate was part of the Unified Command.
And did they have a representative, either virtually or present in the Unified Command?
They did, not present. The representative was aboard the Polar Prince.
Do you know who that representative was?
It was Kyle Bingham.
Was the U.S. Coast Guard aware that submersible operations with passengers on board were taking place near the Titanic wreck site on June 18th, 2023?
So I will not speak for so the first Coast Guard district was not aware.
Okay, thank you. Is there Coast Guard guidance regarding notification of submersible operations within a Coast Guard search and rescue area of responsibility?
I don't know.
In your professional opinion, do you think advance notifications of such activities to the Coast Guard would aid in search and rescue operations?
I don't know necessarily if it would aid in search and rescue operations. I think you want to have a general sense of what's happening in your area of responsibility. In my current role as the sector commander and captain of the port, if these operations were going on somewhere in my captain of the port zone, I would want to be aware of that.
And when did you learn that you were no longer in the search and rescue mode or the distress phase and the Titan was a complete loss and all lives on board were lost?
It was on Thursday morning when the Odysseus arrived on scene. The first piece of they discovered the tail cone first, and then as we continued to find additional debris, it became apparent that it had been a total loss.
And who made the next of kin notifications?
I did.
Did you feel that you were provided all available information from OceanGate during the search?
Well, I mean, hindsight's 20/20. We certainly, there is so much information that's been discussed over the past 2 weeks. I think it's a valuable point to say we didn't have a fraction of that in any search and rescue case. Maybe they start off like that, right? There's a saying that we use that the initial reports are always wrong and they're late. And in the fog of that response, things change. So we certainly didn't have the level of information that's been brought forth.
Thank you, Captain. That's all I have, Mr. Neubauer.
Thank you. I want to make just a statement to the record that the NBI has not received any evidence to date indicating that there may have been a disturbance around the Polar Prince around the time of the implosion. Captain Frederick, we've been going for over an hour. I'd like to take a recess at this time, and we will reconvene at 11:45.